Hi, this is Lili Sanderson, and you're listening to Choosing Glory. Thank you for joining me. I'm going to take a minute and tell you what is in this picture behind me. A few people have asked me, and I realize that it's not an easy picture to understand. It's an original painting by Dennis Smith. Dennis Smith is the sculptor who many of you are familiar perhaps with Dennis Smith because of the sculptures he's done. Temple Square has several of these Dennis Smith sculptures. They're also in Nauvoo. The woman praying on her knees. Small versions are sold of this at bookstores and so on. The family, the mother with a few children in a circle, a mother with her son. Anyway, there are several of these Dennis Smith sculptures that he has done for the church, really beautiful pieces. Well, when he was a BYU student, he was in my husband's ward, the Provo 9th ward, very close to campus. And Chris was a teenager at the time, and Dennis Smith kind of liked how lanky he was, tall and kind of lanky. So he asked if he could use Chris as a model. And he did some bronzes of Chris. They were, I think, about this tall or so. And in fact, if anybody knows where I could buy a copy of that bronze by Dennis Smith when he was quite young, I would love to know that. But it was featured on a New Era cover once and things like that. But he, as a thank you, did this painting. It's a watercolor with, I don't even know what that, kind of white wash is. But anyway, not being all that acquainted with this work, the background is watercolor. And then I think it's some sort of white ink that he used, because that's Chris. This is Chris's head. And that's his arm behind his head like this. And this is, his legs. And Chris was actually lying on their living room floor or family room floor, just kind of watching TV or something. And Dennis Smith used that as his modeling. And then he wrote a tiny script here about contemplating a dust mote, and that there could be a whole world on the dust mote observing us, or something like that. It's been a while since I've read all the words, but anyway, that is my husband Chris when he was a teenager. So I like having him here backing me up, which he always did, and I believe he still does. I apologize for being a little hoarse today. That's been happening a lot. So thank you to all of you who are subscribing on Patreon. I appreciate it so very much. It is allowing me to continue. I'm very grateful. Okay, let's talk about these chapters. And it's interesting because we've had these lessons one week after another of like 2 or 3 chapters, and they were doctrinally dense, and I mean in the best way, right? Really thick with good stuff and things worth studying and contemplating and considering. And then they throw this lesson in, which covers 10 chapters, and it's a lot. They're not short chapters necessarily. So we cover a lot of pages, a lot of material, but it is some of the war chapters of Alma, right? And so it's maybe not so much about doctrine in some respects, although I think there is always doctrine if we look. And we're going to talk about some of the pretty cool messages that I think can come out of here. But I am not going to even try to cover all the beautiful things that are stated in these chapters. I hope you really took the time to mark those or study them or note them as you read through and discuss them with your loved ones. It's too much to cover. I remember the first time I taught gospel doctrine, and I've taught gospel doctrine in several wards over the years. The first time I felt a little stressed, and I remember talking to Chris about this and saying, there's so much wonderful material here that is important to understand and discuss, and I can't possibly hope to get through all of it. As I was talking to Chris, I realized, and he had good things to comment on, but then I realized as I was expressing these concerns, I said, you know what? I'm trying to read the scriptures for the members of the class, and I need to stop. I can't possibly read the scriptures for everybody else. we each go through the scriptures and hopefully invite the Spirit to impress upon us the things that we can learn that are needful or useful or relevant to where we are in life. And that's why if we continue to read the scriptures diligently, we reread the same material again and again, and we discover new things, or different things stand out to us, or again impress us in meaningful ways. And I think it's wonderful that we have this miracle of scripture that can be so personal if we come at it with humility and a desire to learn and a desire to invite the Spirit into the process. So I'm not going to try to read these scriptures for you. I wish I could in some respects, but I know that would be a fool's errand. It's amazing stuff. And I hope that what we discussed today will help in your appreciation of how, there is doctrine everywhere. As I said, we might think this is more historical, just kind of a chronological history of what happened during these wars that the Nephites had with the Lamanites, one after another, and some of the dissensions and all that. But there's powerful stuff. Okay, let's go cover some of the just basic structural stuff, though. We also have the official transfer of the records from Alma to Helaman. That stewardship passes from Alma to Helaman. And we know that he already had told Helaman that was his intention, and that was in an earlier chapter when he was speaking to his sons. But it actually happens in chapter 45 of this section. And in chapter 45, as Alma is concluding his ministry and passing this on to his son Helaman, he bears testimony of Jesus Christ, which is perfect, right? This is the ultimate witness that every prophet bears. They are special witnesses of Jesus Christ. And he then shares with his son Helaman that he has been given the information in a revelatory way that 400 years after the time Jesus Christ shall manifest himself unto the Nephites, they shall dwindle in unbelief. So Alma, as with many of the prophets, is given this panoramic view of the world, and in this case of his people, the Nephites. And he sees Christ coming to them, and then he sees that 400 years later they dwindle in unbelief, which really is not a long time, but look how quickly we lose things, right? And the people of Nephi shall become extinct. This is chapter 45, verse 11. Verse 12, yea, and this because they shall dwindle in unbelief and fall into the works of darkness and lasciviousness and all manner of iniquities. Yea, I say unto you that because they shall sin against so great light and knowledge, I say unto you that from that day even the fourth generation shall not pass away before this great iniquity shall come. So a tragic end to the Nephite people as a nation. And we know that there's a blending of whoever were the more righteous among the Nephites and the Lamanites at the time of Christ. So as far as the bloodlines go, they're very mixed. And after that, they are only distinguished by those who kind of hold to the gospel for a little longer and those that rebel against it. The Nephites holding to the gospel a little longer and the Lamanites rebelling against it. So that division is no longer by descent, it's by choice. But, it's always about our choice, right? Anyway, Alma blesses Helaman in verse 15 and also blessed the earth for the righteous sake. And that is comforting to me and should be to all of us, that the earth is always blessed for the righteous sake. In verse 16, toward the end of that verse, for this is the cursing and the blessing of God upon the land. Interesting, right? This is the cursing and the blessing. And we always know that, this is a land of promise in the United States or Americas, but that this blessing also contains a curse. And why? As he explains it here, for the Lord cannot look upon sin with the least degree of allowance. Now, that's an echo that, I should say it's echoed later in the Doctrine and Covenants, section 1, right? I think it's verse 31, where it tells us again that I, the Lord, cannot look upon sin with the least degree of allowance. Some people talk about, and I have talked about, how we're watering down some of the commandments or the conditions upon which men are saved, which are words right out of Scripture, that while God's mercy and grace are so extensive and his love is universal, that we are the ones who limit ourselves in terms of what we are willing to receive through covenant and through following diligently on that covenant path. So we have to be aware that there is a strictness to the commandments. I was talking to my daughter Caitlin the other day about some of these chapters, and we commented on the verse in Alma 35 where he says, be not offended by the strictness of the word. And Caitlin noted that, well, we recognize that the word is one of the names of Jesus Christ. So think of that substitution. Not being offended by the strictness of Jesus Christ. Not because he is not loving and kind and merciful, and not because he hasn't extended his atoning grace to every human being, but because there is a straight and narrow path. And if we choose to rebel against that, then he cannot save us in our sins. He cannot save us in our rebellion, only from it. When we leave rebellion behind and we become humble, we choose to be humble, or maybe are compelled to be humble, but then we are humble and we come unto him with broken hearts and contrite spirits, then he is mighty to save. Otherwise, we may continue to be offended by the strictness of the word or the strictness of Jesus Christ. The Lord cannot look upon sin with the least degree of allowance. So you can call that strict if you choose, and I think it is strict in the most loving way, because it is not loving or charitable to lie to people and say that you can have all of the benefits without any of the essential prerequisites. The process by which we can become capable of receiving the glory and the power that God desires to offer us. Well, that he does offer us and that he desires to give to us. Okay. Anyway, he blesses the church. Alma does this, and then in verse 18, when he had done this, he departed out of the land of Zarahemla. Later, as to his death or burial, we know not of. Behold, this we know, that he was a righteous man. The saying went abroad in the church that he was taken up by the Spirit or buried by the hand of the Lord, even as Moses. So they don't know exactly, but that's a kind of a saying that went on because the Lord took Moses unto himself, and we suppose he also received Alma in the Spirit unto himself. For this cause we know nothing concerning his death and burial. So it's kind of a mysterious ending to Alma's life, but knowing that he was a righteous man, they know that something was in the plan for him there. Now, let's talk about the big theme of this, well, one of the themes of these chapters that I want to point out, and that is the dissensions of the people. I noticed again and again in these chapters that there were verses that talked about the dissensions and disturbances among the Nephites. Oh, I'm sorry, before I get there, let me just mention that starting with chapter 45 is the record of Helaman, and then we have a little heading, an extra heading there, that says that this is an account of the people of Nephi, their wars and dissensions in the days of Helaman, according to the record of Helaman. And this comprises chapters 45 to 62 inclusive. So we have those several chapters written, not quite, about 17 chapters written by Helaman that end the book of Alma. And then we have Helaman's book that contains another 16 chapters. So we really have 35 chapters, only 9 chapters fewer than his father Alma. We think of Alma, the book of Alma, and we know it's 63 chapters and it's the longest book in the Book of Mormon. But a significant part of the end is written by Alma's son Helaman. So just a little detail that's kind of interesting to me. And I think we hear a different voice in Helaman's record. And one of the big themes that Helaman talks about are the dissensions amongst the people. And here in chapter 45, right after he talks about his father's ending of his mortal life and ministry, verse 21, for behold, because of their wars with the Lamanites and many little dissensions and disturbances which had been among the people, it became expedient that the word of God should be declared among them, yea, and that a regulation should be made throughout the church. Now, he's going to use that word a lot, and it's right there in the complete heading of his writings that he talks about the wars and the dissensions throughout these chapters. So let's just look at some of the other places he mentions this. Chapter 46, verse 6. So Amalekiah, who is a pretty important character that we'll talk about in a moment, who is a Nephite apostate, who wants to gain control and be a king amongst the Nephites. And so, what does it say here? In verse 6, they were led away by Amalickiah to dissensions, notwithstanding the preaching of Helaman and his brethren. So even though Helaman and his brethren are making a big effort to try to teach the people and keep them united, Amalickiah comes and there are many dissensions that start. Verse 11 mentions it again. It came to pass that when Moroni, who was chief commander of the armies of the Nephites, and heard of these dissensions, he was angry with Amalickiah. Verse 28, let's see if I can read the right verses here. Got a lot of things marked. And it talks again about Moroni. He sends forth into all parts of the land where there were dissensions. So this word is used again and again in the writings of Helaman because that's what's going on in the church. Now, does that ring a bell? Because it seems to me like we have a lot of dissensions right now. There are a lot of great people in the church who are trying to do what's right. But we have a lot of voices. As I said, Harper had quoted this to me, that microphones have become way too cheap. I can set up a microphone and all of a sudden I have a voice, and others can also set up a microphone and we can sow either, seeds of unity or of discord and dissension. We can criticize the scriptures. We can criticize the prophets. We can try to pull people into various paths of belief that are not in harmony with the teachings of the gospel of Jesus Christ and God's church. It's his authorized kingdom on the earth, made of imperfect people, yes, but designated with his authority. And we can either try to unify to that standard or we can sow dissension. And there's so much dissension now. Of course, social media has added to that because everybody can have a voice on social media and post or argue or join into chats or whatever. And there are so many dissenting voices. I really felt that as I read through Helaman's words here in the last chapters, or some of the last chapters of Alma. I'm not going to read all the verses, but in verse 36 of chapter 47, not long after their dissensions, they became more hardened and impenitent. Do we see that happening around us? Chapter 51, contentions and dissensions. This had been hitherto a cause of all their destruction. And remember, this sociological principle I've talked about before, that when there's attacking from outside, it tends to strengthen our borders, strengthen our boundaries, because we're all facing a similar enemy. So any group that is attacked from outside kind of circles the wagons, so to speak, and becomes more cohesive. But when, and I talked about Aesop's fable about the bet between the sun and the north wind, if the sun is shining and we seem to have a relative peace and prosperity, it's easy then to start quibbling and easy to criticize and easy to start dissensions. And the Nephites had been very blessed and prospered. And what do? They start these arguments and dissensions among them. And as it says, this had hitherto been a cause of all their destruction. Chapter 53, same thing in the heading, dissensions among the Nephites give rise to Lamanite victories. I think I put this on Patreon, so I don't know that I mentioned it here, but I quoted some things on Patreon about unity and following the leaders. And one of the earlier in this dispensation apostles mentioned how noted the Latter-day Saints typically are for their unity. And this comes because we follow our leaders. And I think that's really important. If we lose allegiance to the designated prophet and leaders of the church, not that we claim that they are infallible, not that we think that they're plaster saints. We know that this is a lay organization. And as Gordon B. Hinckley kind of joked about the missionaries to his family, well, they're not much, but they're all the Lord has. And then his daughter, when he was called to be the prophet, kind of turned it on her dad and said, well, Dad, you're not much, but you're all the Lord's got. And that was a nice chuckle moment, right? Because, yeah, we all have our flaws. And all of us, hopefully, are doing our part, lifting where we stand, but we're imperfect. And yet, if we focus on those imperfections in our leaders and we either now or in the past go back and try to tear down their authority. This is a problem. And the lack of unity is what makes us weak. Our boundaries are weakened. Our borders are weakened when we have dissension amongst us. So as prophesied, persecution will increase. And it will be interesting to see how we respond. Will we, like some of the Nephites, go over to the enemy? Or will we strengthen our boundaries? Will we circle the wagons and become more unified? Now, let me throw in another thought here. I've been talking to my kids about this when I get a chance, or to others, that I've thought so much about becoming a Zion people, and you hear me talk about it all the time. Look at the definition of Zion. One heart, one mind, no poor. Honestly, not to water anything down, but I think the one heart might be easier than the one mind. I think there are a lot of good people who love the Lord, who love God, who want to do what's right. They want to love their neighbor. And they have an honest desire to do good and to be good. But one mind? Brothers and sisters, look around. We are so far from being of one mind. And dissensions, again, are the opposite of Zion. One mind. How are we going to get to be one mind? We can't even agree on what modesty is. We can't agree as a people on whether or not it's important to or how to wear the garment. We can't always agree on, well, we certainly don't agree on politics. Look at how many different forms of opinions there are within the church on politics. I'm not saying politics are the most important, but it's part of where we live. And this year in the United States is an election year, and there are such strong disagreements. I was talking to my son Adam about this just last weekend, and he was saying, so does that mean we would have to all vote the same, or would we still have different ways to vote? And I don't presume to know the answer to that exactly. I'm not trying to speak for the Lord. But as we discussed it, I said, well, doesn't it seem that we would at least have very similar and overlapping opinions about what was good for a community, what was good for a nation, what would more correctly support the Constitution or our God-given and God-inspired Constitution, and that would protect our freedoms? Like, isn't that what Moroni does here in these chapters with the title of liberty? He states the cause of liberty and how to worship the God. And honestly, it's a political thing that goes on, because you've got Amalickiah who wants to be king, and then later you have the king men against the free men. Like, there are some political issues that emerge here. And Moroni actually gets permission to compel the support of the armies. People either will willfully serve the country in the military, or they are imprisoned and sometimes put to death. So, I mean, it's pretty clear that there is a philosophy that is given as the right way in the Book of Mormon. So I find that fascinating, and I would invite each of us to consider, how do we become of one mind? And it seems to me that the only way that can happen is if we all receive the mind of Christ through the power of the Holy Ghost. And again, look at how President Nelson has been saying we need to hear him. And is that relevant to what I'm discussing? Because if we are all hearing the same voice, we will all get closer to being one mind. Because the mind of Christ is consistent and perfect. So in order to have unity in Zion, we need to acquire the mind of Christ. And we need to be humble enough to be corrected in views that we have that may not really align with Zion, that might not really be the Lord's will. I mean, I'm talking pretty high level here, brothers and sisters. This is not to discourage people. It's just to help us realize that we have a ways to go and that it's going to take humility and it's going to take revelation. Notice how the 12 operate. And I've talked about this before because Cleon Skousen was a good friend of my parents, and he's the one who told them that prior to President Hinckley being in the first presidency as a third counselor, when the president and the other two counselors were ill, and that first happened with President Kimball and then it happened with President Benson, he did not feel comfortable proceeding as they had in the past, which was that after discussing everything together with the quorum of the 12, the first presidency would then counsel together and come up with an answer or a direction to go forward with, and then they would present it to the 12 for a sustaining vote. But when President Hinckley was the only healthy member of the first presidency, he didn't feel comfortable doing that because it would have been basically a unilateral decision that he was making, since the other members of the first presidency were not fully available to function in that leadership capacity. And he wasn't okay with that. So he changed the orders of operation so that they had to be unanimous. And since those days, the first presidency and the 12 have been unanimous about their decisions. Now, what does that mean? That if they don't agree, they wait and they go to the Lord and try to, the way I would understand it, humble themselves to seek that unity, to seek the harmony of revelation, where if we're all listening to the same voice through the Spirit, we will hear the same answer. So there is work for us to do. And while we can't control our neighbors, and this is not our job to go out there and tell them that they're wrong and we're right, that's not the way it works. I hope you know that. But it's important for us to personally be humble enough to really try to receive the mind of Christ and become unified with him, and to ask him to correct our thinking if we're incorrect, if we're off on a tangent or off on some kind of path. And if we humbly do so, we will become more unified as a people. And as that member of the 12 that whose name I can't remember right now, mentioned, it might have been Stephen Richards, who I think might have even been in the first presidency, but his comment that the saints have always been seen by others as being very unified because we listen to our prophets. Well, some of that has fallen apart here in our day of dissension, right? Maybe the wheat growing with the tares, we're hearing a lot of dissenting voices. Some are still saying, they're going to change the rules in the temple to allow gay marriages. Others are complaining that Brigham Young was a rebel or deceived or something. Others are, of course, trying to throw Joseph Smith under the bus. Others are complaining about Russell Nelson or other prophets. And as those voices and dissensions continue, we are farther and farther from Zion. Further and further and farther and farther. Both meanings are applicable there. So think about that as you read through these chapters, the dissensions and disturbances that come and how that weakens their boundaries and makes them vulnerable to the Lamanite wars and warlike activity and attacks. So anyway, this goes on, and even in the chapters that we're going to read next week as we finish the book of Alma, we're going to see those themes continue, that there are dissensions and they cause all kinds of problems. Now, let's talk about the amazing men that live concurrently during this time. Now, there might have been really good men that lived in other times of the Nephite history and other times of world history, but we don't always get to know a little bit about them or even hear their names, and that they all kind of come together in a common cause. But there are some times where that has happened in the world, and this is one of them. And it's a beautiful collaboration of really powerful men. We're introduced, of course, early in these chapters, right there, I think in 43, to Captain Moroni. Let me get to the right page here. Yes. Verse 16 of chapter 43, now the leader of the Nephites, or a man who had been appointed to be the chief captain over the Nephites, now the chief captain took the command of all the armies of the Nephites, and his name was Moroni. Verse 17, and Moroni took all the command and the government of their wars, and he was only 25 years old when he was appointed chief captain over the armies of the Nephites. He's young, and he's the chief commander over this entire nation's military. And he's brilliant, and he's righteous. And let's read a little bit more about Moroni in chapter 48. Let's go to chapter 48. Verse 11, and Moroni was a strong and a mighty man. He was a man of a perfect understanding. Now, how often is something like that said about anyone? He was a man of a perfect understanding. Now, that would sound like one mind with the Savior. Yea, a man that did not delight in bloodshed, a man whose soul did joy in the liberty and freedom of his country and his brethren from bondage and slavery. There's such a tribute to this character here. It is extraordinary. Verse 12, yea, a man whose heart did swell with thanksgiving to his God for the many privileges and blessings which he bestowed upon his people, a man who did labor exceedingly for the welfare and safety of his people. Verse 13, yea, and he was a man who was firm in the faith of Christ, and he had sworn with an oath to defend his people, his rights, and his country and his religion, even to the loss of his blood. And it goes on, just part of verse 14, he teaches his people to defend themselves, but to never give an offense. They don't start fights. They may respond to them, but they don't start them. And never to raise the sword except it were against an enemy, except if it were to preserve their lives. Oh, I should have looked this up, but I didn't think of it till just now. A couple of my kids, one of my daughters-in-law, Angela, I think first introduced this book to the family, but it's a biography of President Garfield, who was assassinated just a brief time into his first term. Was it like 8 months or something? He's shot, I forget, but it's not very long. And then he lived for a few months, lingered, and really was killed by infection, not by the wound itself. And it's a fascinating story called Destiny of a Nation. And the author does a great job. I apologize that I can't remember her name right now. I don't have that with me, but my daughter-in-law Angela introduced that book. My daughter Caitlin encouraged me to read it the other day again, and so I read it. One of his quotes, it names many quotes of James Garfield, and he must have been a really good man. And, you know, he was such a brief president in the history of the United States that I didn't know very much about him other than he was assassinated. But it is really quite the story, and he's an impressive character, and he's quoted throughout the biography. And in that, one of the quotes was something about how he does not seek war, but if war comes knocking at his door, it will find him home. That's what I think of when I read this too. Good men never start war. They don't seek war. They don't seek to offend or to create contention. But if war comes, they will find that these good men are home, and they will respond as they need to defend the things that they love. There have always been wonderful men who have had as part of their calling as God's sons to rise up and defend the things that are vulnerable, that are in their stewardship. And I am so grateful for these good men. We're going to talk about that more, but here, the ultimate capstone sort of description of, or paean of praise to Moroni is in verse 17 of chapter 48. Yea, verily, verily, I say unto you, if all men had been and were and ever would be like unto Moroni, behold, the very powers of hell would have been shaken forever. Yea, the devil would never have power over the hearts of the children of men. Can you put it any higher than that? If everybody were like Captain Moroni, the powers of hell would be shaken forever and would never have any power to destroy again. And then in verse 18, here's what I was saying about other men at the same time who are also of this caliber. Verse 18, behold, he was a man like unto Ammon, the son of Mosiah, yea, and even the other sons of Mosiah, yea, and also Alma and his sons, for they were all men of God. And we add to the mix here in these chapters, Lehi, another general, Teancum, another general, who are men of God. This is an amazing group of people. Look at it. The 4 sons of Mosiah, Alma and his 3 sons. That's 7. Captain Moroni, 8. Lehi, Teancum, 9, 10. Am I leaving anybody out that we know by name? That's amazing. And then we're going to have the whole sons of Helaman that come up, you know. Some amazing men that coexist. Now, Harper has mentioned to me, my son Harper has mentioned, because he has really studied these chapters and loves these great men. And he said, you know, think about it. The editor of this book is Mormon, who himself was a military man. And at an extremely young age, even younger than 25, is made the captain or the chief of all the armies of the Nephites. He was large in stature and so impressive that grown men followed this young lad into battle. That's extraordinary. You think that he had an identification with Captain Moroni and these wonderful men? Perhaps, to the point where, what does General Mormon name his own son? Moroni. I think he loved these men and patterned his life like unto them, and so can we. I'm not a man, and I don't aspire to be. Let's not get confused, right? But our sons have wonderful role models, and we women can be worthy to be their partners and be equally yoked with these men of God. We can be women of God without seeking to co-opt each other. We can collaborate and cooperate and use those divinely given division of labor qualities and characteristics that are divinely masculine and divinely feminine, and create families and create communities and ultimately create Zion. We got to do it his way, not our way. Our world is making men feel really bad about being men. And this is so awful, as I've mentioned before. In the second hour group of church, if you go around the building, primary, young men's, young women's, Relief Society, priesthood, the priesthood group, the elders quorum, are the most susceptible to committing suicide. 4 times as likely as women. It's not because they're weak, brothers and sisters. It's because they've been battered. Our world has been cruel to masculinity. The genderless, asexual, transgender, whatever. I'm not saying women have escaped, because women have been attacked also. But the way the adversary has set it up, in creating this adversarialism, women then attack men, and men can attack women. But there is a lot of nastiness that has gone on in this so-called battle of the sexes that should never have begun. There should have been a total collaboration always between men and women. I realize sometimes we're not working with a partner who wants the same things we do, and we have to become non-victim Christians. Different conversation, but also very important. But I am saying that the goal is collaboration, not duplication, not being the same, being divinely distinct and becoming the best version of ourselves, the best version of womanhood, the best version of manhood, and helping our children to feel good about being who they are. I'm talking about that in a moment too. But this really reminded me of another time in history, or a period of history, where some amazing men came together. Maybe you can read my mind and guess what's coming, but I'm going to hold that thought for a moment. Let me just look at a couple of other verses here, because really, again, too many wonderful things to say and to quote. But in chapter 46, going back a little bit, verse 8, we get a preview of something that Helaman is really going to hit again in his own book in chapter 12. But here's the preview of the message that he gives in his own book. Verse 8 of chapter 46, thus we see how quick the children of men do forget the Lord their God, yea, how quick to do iniquity and to be led away by the evil one. He sees this, like prosperity and comfort, whatever, can really weaken our boundaries. And he sees it, and he lives with it, and sees the cost to his people and how much power it gives to their enemies. And then verse 9, yea, and we also see the great wickedness one very wicked man can cause to take place among the children of men. And he's talking about Amalickiah. And Amalickiah, he's such a case study in deviousness and evil. And there are things written in the curriculum that are interesting about how, he kind of convinces the king of the Lamanites, who will not engage with him, but Amalickiah keeps coming closer and finally gets him to come down just a little to meet with Amalickiah, and that's the beginning of the end for the king of the Lamanites, who ultimately, through craftiness and cunning, Amalickiah causes to be murdered, and then he blames the other servants, and then he goes and marries the queen, and Amalickiah is really evil, and Helaman is saying, even one evil man can cause so much misery, and he does. And then his brother Ammoron takes over after Amalickiah is finally killed by Teancum, and creates, the same kinds of misery going forward. But Amalickiah is a case study of evil and how we need to give no quarter to evil. Just like Christ says, I cannot look upon sin with the least degree of allowance, neither should we give any quarter to evil. And if there's somebody of evil influence in our lives, we need to protect ourselves and set appropriate boundaries, not to give offense, not to be guilty of offending them. But if war comes to our door, it needs to find us home in order to protect our lives and our loved ones as non-victim Christians. Okay, so I think those are worth mentioning. We talked about the beautiful words describing Captain Moroni and how that applied to all these amazing men. They were all men of God. Interestingly, even though there is so much war and the loss of thousands and thousands of soldiers on both sides, it's interesting that in chapter 50, verse 21, we see that these promises have been verified. And he's talking about the blessings that come and the prospering in the land. In the verse just before, verse 21, we see these promises have been verified to the people of Nephi, for it has been their quarrelings and their contentions. Okay, doesn't use the word dissensions. It's the same thing. Their quarrelings and contentions, yea, their murderings and their plunderings, their idolatry. What do we worship? What do we give our time and our substance or our attention to? Their whoredoms, their abominations, which were among themselves, which brought upon them their wars and their destructions. Verse 22, and those who were faithful in keeping the commandments of the Lord were delivered at all times. Now, we've talked about the delivery of the Lord and how it doesn't happen in the moment necessarily, but in God's time, deliverance comes. It may take 40 years sometimes, or 8 years in the wilderness for Nephi, but then he had other battles to overcome or deal with. But deliverance comes, and our hope is in that deliverance. Our deliverer, our redeemer, our savior, that there will be a day of deliverance for the righteous. And then in verse 23, but behold, there never was a happier time among the people of Nephi. Is that surprising? I mean, it can be a little bit surprising, right? Like, this is a tough time. They're working like crazy to protect their cities and build defenses and swords, weapons and walls and the big mounds of earth and all this stuff. And then they have to go to war and they lose so many people. And there are troubles amongst them, and there are quarrels and contentions and dissensions, but there never was a happier time among the people of Nephi since the days of Nephi than in the days of Moroni. Yea, even at this time in the 21st year of the reign of the judges. So that's pretty amazing. So it's that peace in the midst of the storm. God doesn't always calm the storm. Sometimes he calms his child. And that is what we can seek. I'm seeking that I can have the calm in the storm. Okay, we can talk about the details here. We're not going to talk too much about it. We're going to mention that the chief judge, part of this time is Nephihah. And then when he dies, he leaves, he had fulfilled his position with perfect righteousness or perfect uprightness. And then the judgment seat is filled by his son Pahoran, or Pahoran. I never know how to pronounce that. Let's say Pahoran. And he becomes a great character too. So we have another man. I guess I left him off the list originally, but there's another great man here, Pahoran, who also fights for the cause of liberty and fulfills his judgment seat righteously. Okay, so what is that other group of people that are men that I wanted to talk about? And it's, maybe you guessed, it's during the Revolutionary period in the United States. I'm not saying there haven't been good men other times of the world, but this was another extraordinary time where so many men of strength and character and sound minds and great courage came together to do what the Lord asked them to do. This is not a comprehensive list, right? Which is even more amazing because there were so many. But John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, Benjamin Franklin, Benjamin Rush, George Washington, I mean, amazing. All of these. I'm a big John Adams fan, but like all of these men have my respect, even though they all had their frailties, right? James Madison, John Hancock, Patrick Henry, I mean, go on, and Sam Adams, like, there were so many, and all the signers of the Declaration of Independence who pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honors, and many of them lost their fortunes. Some of them lost their lives. I mean, they gave great sacrifices to the cause of liberty in this land, and that they all came to this new colony. Like, the entire world, somehow produced these men who ended up in the same place at the same time with the same inspiration and brought forth this nation with an absolute divine providence, making it happen through their courage. So, they were pretty young. They weren't 25 necessarily, but George Washington was only 43 when they made him. That might seem old to some of you, but John Adams was 40. Jefferson was 33 when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. And anyway, I'm going to share something from David McCullough's, who many of you know from his book on John Adams, and another book that he wrote, 1776, really marvelous works and great histories. He spoke at BYU in September of 2005, and the theme of his speech was the glorious cause of America. And he told this story. Well, he told a few stories, but I'm going to quote from him in that devotional address, or I guess it was a forum. It was a forum, but it was really inspirational. So I'm going to skip over some of the details, of course, but Washington, from the beginning of the war, had been in continual retreat from Cornwallis and the most powerful military force in the world, the English army. And he just kept retreating. He had to cross rivers, and it was at night, and he was losing people to the cold and to hunger, and didn't really have money to pay his troops. I mean, it was a crazy time. And he started out, I forget, I should have written down the number, but I mean, at the beginning he had like 6,000 or more. And by the time he crossed the Delaware, not the famous time, but the first time that he crossed the Delaware to escape the advancing English, he went into Pennsylvania to regroup. And by the time he'd crossed over into Pennsylvania, he had only 3,000 soldiers left, and they were a ragtag group. And having barely escaped, again, the advancing English military, they were trying to recover. And McCullough says this: the next morning, a unit from Pennsylvania rode in, militiamen, among whom was a young officer named Charles Wilson Peale, the famous painter. He walked among those ragged troops of Washington's who had made the escape across from New Jersey and wrote about it in his diary. He said he'd never seen such miserable human beings in all his life. Starving, exhausted, filthy. One man in particular he thought was just the most wretched human being he had ever laid eyes on. He described how the man's hair was all matted and how it hung down over his shoulders. The man was naked except for what they call a blanket coat. His feet were wrapped in rags. His face all covered with sores from sickness. Peale was studying him when all of a sudden he realized that the man was his own brother. That's tender and horrifying. And then McCullough says, I think we should feel that they were all our brothers, those brave 3,000, and remember what they went through. A little later, he says, most everybody concluded that the war was over and we had lost. It was the only rational conclusion one could come to. There wasn't a chance. So Washington did what you sometimes have to do when everything is lost and all hope is gone. He attacked. So they crossed the Delaware again. Now, you may have heard there are a lot of historical inaccuracies to that famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, but McCullough says it does capture the force of personality, the character of the men who dared to attack under those circumstances of incredible disadvantage and weakness. The worst part of the whole night was not the crossing, as bad as it was. The worst part was the march through the night. Again, a northeaster was blowing, and again that northeaster was beneficial to our cause because it muffled the noise of the crossing and the noise of the march south. But it also increased by geometric proportions the misery of the troops. It was very cold. What the wind chill factor must have been can only be imagined. It was so cold that 2 men froze to death on the march because they had no winter clothing. While they were moving, they froze to death. They struck at Trenton the next morning. It was a fierce, house-to-house, savage battle. It was small in scale, but very severe. It was all over in about 45 minutes, and we won. For the first time, we defeated the enemy at their own profession. Skipping again, McCullough continues, in conclusion, I want to share a scene that took place on the last day of the year of 1776, December 31st. All the enlistments for the entire army were up. Every soldier, because of the system at the time, was free to go home as of the first day of January, 1777. Washington called a large part of the troops out into formation. He appeared in front of these ragged men on his horse, and he urged them to re-enlist. He said that if they would sign up for another 6 months, he'd give them a bonus of $10. It was an enormous amount then, because that's about what they were being paid for a single month, if and when they could get paid. These were men who were desperate for pay of any kind. Their families were starving. The drums rolled, and he asked those who would stay on to step forward. The drums kept rolling, and nobody stepped forward. Washington turned and rode away from them. Then he stopped, and he turned back and rode up to them again. This is what we know, he said. My brave fellows, you have done all I asked you to do, and more than could be reasonably expected. But your country is at stake, your wives, your houses, and all that you hold dear. You have worn yourselves out with fatigues and hardships, but we know not how to spare you. If you will consent to stay 1 month longer, you will render that service to the cause of liberty and to your country, which you can probably never do under any other circumstances. Again the drums rolled. This time the men began stepping forward. God Almighty, wrote Nathaniel Greene, inclined their hearts to listen to the proposal, and they engaged anew. When the war was at last over, Washington, in one of the most important events in our entire history, turned back his command to Congress. A scene portrayed in a magnificent painting by John Trumbull that hangs in the rotunda of our national Capitol. When George III heard that George Washington might do this, he said, if he does, he will be the greatest man in the world. As you know, George Washington refused to be king. And after the sacrifices he had made and what he did with a ragtag army of untrained militiamen over one of the longest wars this country has ever endured prior to Vietnam, 8.5 years of the Revolutionary battles before victory was won, it was so extraordinary that this nation would have made him king, and he refused in order to give birth to an entirely new form of government, this republic that was directed and in its foundations and in the writing of its constitution by the Spirit of God. There's more to say. So keep those tender scenes in mind. Think of the title of liberty, which we're going to read in a moment, and then we're going to make our point of application that I hope will resonate with you as it does for me. The title of liberty is in Alma 46, verse 12. So let's just read it. And it came to pass that he rent his coat. Here's Moroni wanting to unite his people to the cause of freedom. He rent his coat, and he took a piece thereof and wrote upon it, in memory of our God, our religion, and freedom. I like the pairing of religion and freedom. I think it's absolutely the case that it requires a free country, a land that protects the rights of worship and the rights of religious expression in the public square, that allows us to worship God in the way that he has designated. So religion and freedom are put right next to each other, I think, for a purpose. And our peace, our wives, and our children. And he fastened upon the end of a pole. And then he takes this throughout the land, right? And he says, let us be rent, just as my cloak is rent, so that we don't forsake God and our responsibilities. And then I wanted to also kind of highlight this wonderful phrase that touched me in chapter 44. This is, of course, that first war that happens with a Zoramite apostate from the Nephites that goes over to the Lamanites and stirs them up to anger. And Zarahemnah is the man that first we read about in these chapters, leading the Lamanite armies against the Nephites. And we're going to talk about this in a moment more, so we're kind of going backwards a little bit to chapter 43, but let's just look at this phrase that he uses when he's talking to Zarahemnah after they've kind of beaten them back to the point where they drop their weapons, and he asks for an oath. And Zarahemnah won't get it, but he does say, this is the true faith of God. Yea, ye see that God will support and keep and preserve us so long as we are faithful unto him and unto our faith and our religion, and never will the Lord suffer that we shall be destroyed, except we should fall into transgression and deny our faith. And then he commands Zarahemnah to make an oath to not come against them again. But at any rate, let's read this beautiful phrase. He says, I command you in the name of that all-powerful God who has strengthened our arms, that we have gained power over you by our faith, our religion, our rites of worship, and our church, by the sacred support we owe to our wives and our children, by that liberty which binds us to our lands and our country, and also the maintenance of the sacred word of God, to which we owe all our happiness, and by all that is most dear unto us. And this is not all. Anyway, he goes on and he says, you need to take an oath that you never break, that you will not come to war again. Of course, Zarahemnah won't take that oath, and so they have to continue the fighting. But let's just focus on that phrase for a minute. He names all these really important principles and institutions that motivate them, and that he is telling even their enemies that this is why we are able to prevail if we are righteous to our God. And I love that phrase, the sacred support which we owe to our wives and our children. I don't know that I've ever keyed on that phrase before, but I love it. The sacred support which we owe to our wives and our children. And women owe a sacred commitment also to our husbands and our children, to all these same wonderful things. But I love that there's this beautiful phrase that describes how God has asked men to use their strength and their power to support their wives and children. And I know that we have to adapt things as necessary in tough situations or a variety of circumstances, but what a beautiful concept that there is this sacred support that good men commit to. And I think we feel it when we are around those good men, and I hope we teach this to our sons. Now, okay, before we kind of end with chapter 43, I'm going to tell you a story that was a parent moment that I couldn't have seen coming, and don't know that I was particularly prepared for, but that I felt was such a blessing to me in terms of helping me understand something, and hopefully to my son Graydon, who asked the question. I've actually shared this before, but I think it's been a few years in the D&C podcasts, but I'm going to share it again. So I'm sorry if this is a repeat for you, but I think it really ties into these chapters, as we'll see in a moment. So I was still teaching at BYU at this time. I think it was after my doctorate, but I was still doing research and writing and teaching, and still had 2 teenage boys at home. So in the evenings, Chris and I would, have dinner, and we would talk about our days and hear from the kids. And then sometimes I would share the kinds of things that I was reading or studying or teaching, because I was always teaching in the areas of marriage and family. So I thought, this was applicable to the kids to know. I wanted, of course, to share it with all the kids. And I usually did call up the other kids at some point to make sure I could share anything that I was learning with them. But this evening was kind of a downer topic. It was on domestic violence. And I had been reading some research, and I came across a study that was done in Utah and was published in the journal. I think it was called the Journal of Family Violence, which is, really a depressing journal title. Nevertheless, it was an interesting study, also kind of a downer. And I just was talking about what happens sometimes when we don't get our foundations in place and have testimonies of what we're doing. I don't want to get into that study right now, but it was what happened after that was the memorable experience this day. I was back after dinner was done, cleaned up. I was back at my desk working on something, and my son Graydon, who was 16 or possibly 17 at the time, kind of came looking for me, and he said, "I have a question for you. Why are men more likely than women to be the perpetrators of domestic violence?" And as I said, I was sort of unprepared for that. I certainly hadn't meant to convey the message that men are bad, women are more innocent. I don't ever feel like that. I hope you have seen that I am not a man basher. I think the only one who wins the battle of the sexes, so to speak, is Satan. We are not meant to be adversaries, but companions and collaborators and cooperative in synergizing the differences that have been given to us as men and women, the divine division of labor, as I often refer to it. Anyway, so I was kind of taken aback and concerned. Of course, I made sure I talked to Harper afterwards too, our younger son, because I wanted to make sure I wasn't intimating anything like that men are just bad, because they're not. But the statistics show that men are more likely than women to hurt their families. And I've mentioned this before too. Women hit men more than men hit women. It is reported by those individuals even. But women tend to hit with an open hand, like in a slap or a push, often a defensive gesture or trying to get some space or whatever. I'm not saying that's okay. I'm just saying that women do hit men more than men hit women, but men put women in the hospital at a huge magnitude greater than women inflict physical damage on men. So again, our bodies are very different. Our musculature is very different. Men more often hit with a closed fist, and it's more of a punch or something that can do a lot of damage physically to a woman. So all of this is really depressing stuff, right? But it was the topic of part of our conversation at dinner. And I was glad that he came, because if that was a question lingering in his mind or a concern that landed on him, here he was on the threshold of manhood as a teenage boy. And I'm so glad that he came and voiced his question and his concern. So, of course, I immediately started to pray inwardly. And as I usually put it, I was praying like crazy to get help with my answer. And the first thought that came was testosterone, which, okay, that's actually a legitimate answer. He actually had gone to ask his dad too, and Chris had mentioned testosterone also. And I had learned this when I was growing up from my sociologist parents and some of our dinner table conversations, that I remembered anyway, that the most violent prisoners in our prisons have highest levels of testosterone. And that is true not only of the men, but of the women. So there is definitely an association between elevated, past the normal healthy range of this hormone. When it goes beyond that into more elevated realms, it is associated with anti-violent behavior. So if the testosterone stays within a healthy realm, it can be wonderful, but when it goes into those elevated realms, it can be dangerous. Men, incidentally, have about 20 times or up to 20 times more testosterone than women on average. So we're very different in that chemical. We all need it, but men have much more. And then I told my son, Graydon, but don't think that it's just some sort of genetic lottery that you might be cursed with elevated levels of testosterone and it's just, you're out of luck, you're going to be a jerk. Not at all. Those chemicals are very reactive and responsive to the choices we make, the involvements that we have, experiences that we have. I hope you know this, that our body chemistry is very affected by what's going on in our lives. That's true of our hormone levels too. They can be very impacted by other experiences or events. For instance, some studies have shown that if a man is on the sexual prowl, like he's going out to the clubs or the bars or whatever, and he's looking to score, then his testosterone levels really get elevated into that danger zone. And that makes sense, doesn't it? But when a man bonds with a woman and commits to a marriage and stays faithful to that marriage, it helps to regulate that hormone and keep it within a healthy realm. Similarly, when he bonds with children and commits to fatherhood and is an involved father, it helps to keep those levels healthy. So that's terrific. At the beginning of a football game, things can change really fast. At the beginning of a football game, both teams have elevated levels of testosterone or high levels. At the end of the football game, which is just a few hours later, the winners have much higher levels than the losers. So you can see how changeable these things are. So it's not just like, oh, bad luck, I have bad levels of this hormone. No, it's very involved with what media we consume, how we behave, what choices we make, how we respect the opposite sex, things like that. So we have a lot of control over those things, or at least some control over those things. Now, as I was talking to Graydon, I said, and also let's not demonize this hormone. This is a very important hormone. And the high levels that men carry of this testosterone hormone are associated with some really important things that bless the world. For instance, building things, carving a living out of the wilderness, being willing to go out and slay the dragon every day instead of, staying by home and hearth. And not that there aren't exceptions, as I said, or adaptation occasionally. Nevertheless, this is the general pattern, as it talks about in the Family Proclamation, that men go out and provide, right? So in this sacred support of their wives and children, which is, again, that beautiful phrase. And this is something that they are designed to do. And I mentioned to my son that it's a good thing that not everybody wants to stay home and hold the babies all day. Mom does a lot more than hold babies, as you know, but just to put it quickly, it's good that men are willing to go and leave home and hearth in order to slay the dragon, so to speak, day after day to provide for their families. Also, that hormone is associated with pushing the frontiers. So it is typically men who have wanted to see what's over the mountain, or what's across the ocean, or what's in space. And that has benefited mankind tremendously. And this is not a comprehensive list, but the third thing that I mentioned to Graydon was it's also, and there's a sad necessity for this, but men are more equipped to fight and to defend in a physical battle against evil or tyranny. And we've talked about men who are willing to do that today. Wonderful men at this season of the Book of Mormon history, as well as men in the history of the United States and other men in other places who have stood for the vulnerable and have stood against evil. And as we had discussed in our family, as we've talked about some of the amazing parts of history where people have demonstrated amazing qualities and sacrifice, good men have stood between tyranny and freedom again and again and have defended freedom or liberated people who were oppressed. And that's a really marvelous thing. It's tragic. War is hell. But sometimes there does need to be a battle. Again, we're hearing that again and again in these chapters. Can I just say, while I'm, again, another aside, God bless all military service members and their wives and their children. This is an enormous gift to the rest of us, and I am so grateful for those of you who have served and are serving, and for the wives or the husbands and the children of those people who make that sacrifice so that we can remain under the blanket of freedom. And it is sometimes a fragile thing that can easily be lost. And I know that there's some real struggles right now with our military forces in the United States and probably in other places. At any rate, I just want to take a minute and express my personal gratitude and thanks for that. I'm sad when sometimes I hear that we'll have people in the church who decry military service or don't honor our veterans on Veterans Day, or those who've passed in the service of their country on Memorial Day, or, the 4th of July, like these events. Sometimes people say like, oh, we should never celebrate anything that has to do with war. But thank God for good men and women who have served. And honestly, it's the men who end up on the front lines, typically. Again, some really brave, wonderful women are involved as well. But I'm grateful for the strength that God has given men that allows them to do this. So back to my conversation with Graydon. So I mentioned these positive things that happen. And when we talked about the necessity of war and battle, sometimes that men are so much better than women equipped to fight when necessary, as sad and heinous as war is, I reminded him of something that we had talked about as a family before, which was Henry V's St. Crispin's Day speech. This is a play by Shakespeare, but it's based on a historical character, a king of England, Henry V, and the Battle of Agincourt. So I mentioned how important it was for the strength that men have and that powerful chemical, that powerful hormone with which they are endowed, and how important it is to harness it to the good. And I said, it's a very strong power that can injure, but can serve and bless and protect if it is harnessed to good purposes. And that's when I mentioned that St. Crispin's Day speech, which I think I've mentioned before. Kenneth Branagh's version on YouTube is my favorite. At any rate, Graydon was familiar, but I reminded him of some of the lines of that speech. And of course, the historical setting is that there were 2,000 Englishmen who were going to face in battle the next day, and the record varies, but 8,000 to 10,000 Frenchmen. So they were outnumbered 4 or 5 to 1. And history tells us that the night before the battle, the Englishmen understandably were fearful and expressing that fear. And Henry, it records in history, gave them a rousing speech. And we don't have a record of what that speech was. Shakespeare's version is quite beautiful. The next day, the English went out and beat the French against all odds, right? Now, part of that speech you're probably familiar with. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he who sheds his blood today with me shall be my brother. And I paused there and I said to Graydon, that is such a guy thing. Like, women don't need to bleed to bond. We can bond over a brunch or a baby shower or a service project, but men do bond, if not in battle, on the field of competition. It's a guy thing that, they kind of knock against each other and bond. So anyway, beautifully expressed by Shakespeare. And then going on, it says things like, gentlemen in England now abed asleep shall think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap while any speaks who's fought with us upon St. Crispin's Day. Lots more beautiful language to that speech. Check it out if you get a chance. So as I was sharing this with Graydon and reminding him of this, I said, so look at that. When they were harnessing the power within them to God and country, to protect their freedoms or fight for their country and their, God and St. George was the English battle cry so often, then amazing things can be accomplished by that power that is harnessed to the good. And then this light bulb went off in my head that gave me an idea I'd never considered before, never heard anybody else talk about, still haven't heard anybody else talk about, but I really believe that this is true. As I was talking to Graydon, I said, you know what the perfect harness for testosterone is? It's the priesthood of God. And as that light bulb illuminated, I said, That is why men are given the priesthood on this earth, in this sphere. It's a license to carry. You have this powerful chemistry, this powerful hormone that can be incredibly destructive and can be incredibly constructive and powerful to do good or powerful to do evil. It needs to be harnessed to the good, to what is true and virtuous. And the priesthood is the perfect harness for men. There are good men who have not had the benefit of receiving that priesthood covenant, but they too have harnessed the power within them to God and country, or wives and children, or protection of the innocent. And we see that pattern again and again. But God has given us in his restored gospel this amazing covenant of the priesthood for men. And I said, not only is this why men have the priesthood, it's why you get it when you're 12. Because that is when those hormones start to come through your system. And God is giving you the blueprint, the pattern, the way to harness that to the good. And I was able to look at Graydon and say, if you honor your priesthood throughout your life, you will never hurt a woman or a child. You will never harm someone. You will serve and lift and bless and protect and be a blessing to everyone who comes within the sphere of your influence. And then I said, and you know what you get when you harness testosterone? You get Captain Moroni. You get Helaman and Lehi and Alma and Tiankim and all these other amazing men that we've been talking about today. You get the sons of Helaman. You get Jesus Christ. And as we kind of wrapped up that idea, Graydon paused for a moment and said, I feel really good about being a man. Brothers and sisters, Satan is after us. He's after men. He's after women. He wants to destroy us. He has declared an entire sex toxic. Through his minions, we talk about toxic masculinity. Well, I don't talk about it. And I hope you don't talk about it either, because it's a lie. Brothers and sisters, any of us can be toxic when we fall to sin or iniquity or selfish and all those things. But we're not toxic when we are acting in our divine roles as men and women, as sons and daughters of God. And how important is it for us to feel good about being a man if you're a man and a woman if you're a woman, and especially to help our sons and our daughters feel good about who they are. This is so incredibly important. Now, that was such a blessed experience for me. And I was so grateful that Graydon had come with his question, and that, as I've said, I was praying my guts out, and I felt like the Lord enlightened my mind to help me share with him something that I had not really put together before. But I truly believe that God, in his infinite wisdom and his perfect understanding and knowledge, has given men the priesthood for a sacred purpose that helps them to harness that power within them. And women, I'm sorry if you've been hurt. I know that we're imperfect. Of course, in this church, it's a lay clergy, it's a lay church. We all can serve in our way, and I hope we do. But we don't need the priesthood in this sphere. Yes, in the temples, not in our mortal sphere. It's not necessary. It doesn't mean we don't have access to the powers of the priesthood in our callings and so on, but come on, there again is a divine division of labor. We've talked before about how these priesthood responsibilities help to bind a man, not only to his family, but to the church, the kingdom of God on earth, because of responsibilities that only men are assigned to fulfill. And if we start, as other churches have done, it's not going to happen, but, ordain women. What happens in those Protestant churches that have allowed women to be clergy and so on is the men disappear. And there's so much evidence of that of course, they don't talk about very much because it's an unpopular notion that denies the narrative. Okay, back to Alma 43, because while I didn't think of it in the moment, the next day I did. And I went back to Graydon and then again Harper and the other kids and said, remember what we were talking about yesterday about harnessing testosterone? Alma 43 is this tremendous story of what happens on both the good and the bad side of that. Because when Zerahemnah brings his Lamanites, remember, the Nephites had armor, breastplates, helmets. They were fairly well protected, at least, relatively speaking, as they went into battle. And compared to the Lamanites were mostly naked, but with just some sort of loincloth and not very well protected. But because they were so enraged by the provocations of the Zoramites and the Amalekites, who were their leaders, right, their group leaders, and Zerahemnah, who was filled with hatred for the Nephites, what does it say? This is chapter 43, verse 44. Yea, they did fight like dragons, and many of the Nephites were slain by their hands. Yea, for they did smite in two many of their head plates, and they did pierce many of their breastplates, and did smite off many of their arms. And thus the Lamanites did smite in their fierce anger. And as I was talking to my sons, and of course I shared this with my daughters too, I said, that is unharnessed testosterone. That's what that is. And it's terrifying, and it's destructive, and it's scary, and it's brutal. But what does it say happened after this? Because remember, and the Lamanites were, a huge number, but they were so unprotected that you'd think the Nephites had an advantage, but because of that ferocity, that terrifying ferocity of unharnessed testosterone, the Nephites are falling back. Nevertheless, verse 45, the Nephites were inspired by a better cause, for they were not fighting for monarchy nor power, but they were fighting for their homes and their liberties, their wives and their children and their all. Yea, for their rights of worship and their church. And they were doing that which they felt was the duty which they owed to their God, for the Lord had said unto them, and also unto the fathers, inasmuch as ye are not guilty of the first offense, neither the second, shall not suffer yourselves to be slain by the hands of your enemy. Okay, they were fighting for a better cause. That is mentioned several times in these chapters, that the Nephites were inspired by a better cause when they were fighting for liberty, for their sacred duty towards their wives and children. So what happens as they start to fall back, and Moroni, perceiving their intent to fall back from this huge attack of unharnessed testosterone, sends forth and inspired their hearts with these thoughts, with these very thoughts, that they were fighting for a better cause, for their wives, their children, their liberty, their rights of worship, their lands, their freedom from bondage. And it came to pass, this is verse 49, that they turned upon the Lamanites. Here are the Nephites who are falling back from this huge onslaught. And they cried with one voice unto their Lord their God for their liberty and their freedom from bondage. And verse 50, they began to stand against the Lamanites with power. Harnessed testosterone beats unharnessed testosterone every time. God is the X factor. Righteousness, the cause for which we fight. When God is in the battle with us, we cannot lose. Brothers and sisters, what a blessing it is to see these principles exemplified in our scripture and in our current world. We can see the damage that unharnessed hormones can do, fed by pornography, by terrible media, by nasty stuff online, contention, the desire to dominate or to express unrighteous dominion or exercise unrighteous dominion. And it can be women too, of course. But brothers and sisters, what a perfect gospel plan. What an amazing covenant of the priesthood that God gives to his sons so that they can harness the power within them that is given to them by divine right, by their Heavenly Father, by our Heavenly Father, in order for us to fulfill our roles and our purposes. I'm so grateful for my husband and my sons who honor their priesthood. I know how blessed our family has been by having a husband and a father who did honor his priesthood and was able to bless us in times of need and to protect us and provide sacred support. So grateful for that, and always will be. I still feel the power of my husband's priesthood in my life, and I'm grateful that my sons carry on that tradition. I'm grateful for all of you men who do. I'm grateful for all of you women who support that and are grateful for it and help as helpmeets and teach both our sons and daughters how sacred these things are and what a blessing they are if we embrace God's ways. As ever, thank you to my husband, Chris Anderson, and to another good man for whom I'm grateful, Doug Larson of Point Digital. Take care.